Hello and welcome to another episode of Spiritually Incorrect. I'm your host, Seth Hart. Joined with me is Jonathan Lyonhart.
Hello, Seth. I'm going to talk in a robotic voice because my deep, booming voice would cause you to stumble and fall into temptation. I'm that masculine and sexy.
I really thought this was you alluding to the fact of Shannon wanting to make a play where
About
there are
robots?
robots. Yeah, and then you veered away to some weird homoerotic, it's weird. Anyway.
I think as an incredibly attractive, virile young man, it's my responsibility to protect our listeners, their purity, their sanctity, and their souls. From I don't want to cause them to stumble. They should be able to listen to my brilliance without succumbing to my beauty.
I think this says far more about your own self-image rather than the image of other people have of you.
It's the image of myself that I see reflected in their beaming, beautiful eyes, which are actually just me in their eyes. So
okay. Okay, so whenever we're not talking about harming other people's purity, let's get on to the conversation of purity culture.
Yay!
So the conversation with Shannon Harris really opened up some interesting topics. Unfortunately, we didn't really get a chance to talk about them, and we don't want to narrowly focus in on what she was talking about, but we do want to open up the conversation of purity culture in general, Christian teaching about sexuality, how that aligns or doesn't align with purity culture, and maybe look at some possible steps forward, maybe ways to improve, just have this conversation in an honest and truthful way about what did we do right, what did we do wrong.
Yeah. Yes.
Jonathan is here to say yes to everything I say, because obviously I know more about this. He's here just to look good, and I'm here to be the brains.
Let your yes be yes and your no be no, Seth. Anything else comes from Satan. So
yeah,
are you Satan here? Are you Satan?
I just want to point out that you didn't just say yes. You said yeah. So.
But my yeah was my yeah. It wasn't anything else.
Jesus didn't say let your yeah be yeah, John.
Yeah, you're right. But he did say anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. And that is the point of today. So let's get into it.
Nice pivot.
Did you like it? Did you like that? I think our audience will like it. It's seamless. They won't even notice, except for me talking right now. So
you're the absolute worst, man.
Have fun editing this later, Seth.
I will. I'm leaving all this in.
So I had an idea I thought it would be fun if part of our discussion today could be us, one person arguing in defense of purity culture and the other arguing against it. And then somewhere along the way, we say switch, and we switch and rotate, and it's the other way. The other person's arguing the other side, and the other one's arguing this side.
I'll start on the defensive. I feel like that's good, and then we can, at some point you can say switch.
Okay, so audience members know that what we say today doesn't necessarily represent everything that we actually think.
What we say ever represents what we actually think.
My yes is never yes, and my no is never no.
Exactly.
All right, well, let's get into it then. Purity culture, Seth. It represses sexuality. It causes people to just hide their desires and to be ashamed of their bodies, to disincarnate, really. What say you?
What say I? Who are the two most influential figures on the Christian church?
Well, you and me, of course.
Obviously. But after us, it would be Jesus and Paul, neither of whom were married. If these are supposed to be our examples, follow me as I follow Christ, Paul said, and of course we're supposed to imitate Christ, then saying that you need sexuality in order to live a complete, happy, wholesome life, that otherwise you're just suppressing it, that is what does injustice to people, because then people who aren't having sex, who aren't living in sexually fulfilling relationships, are going to feel incomplete. That is the true harm. Purity culture protects us and protects the fact that sex is an important aspect of the human life, but it's not a needed aspect. It is not an end in itself. Sexual pleasure is not an end in itself. It is merely a means to an end of a happy, wholesome relationship, particularly a marriage relationship, John.
Well, I can definitely get on board with some aspects of that, but the irony is that purity culture often seems to be that which negates singleness as a legitimate end. Purity culture almost seems to start early on in those preterm years and say, we are preparing you for marriage, for courtship. Start praying now for your future husband. Start praying now for your future spouse. Start purifying your sexuality and your heart so that one day you can have sexual relations that are pure and holy. And I think these purity culture movements tend to occur, especially in small town conservative places where almost everyone is married by like 24, 25. I mean, I got married at 22 and I was considered a late bloomer. You got married in your late 20s and it was practically a joke at that point. So like,
you're practically a joke.
But like, you know what I'm saying? Purity culture also seems to overemphasize relationship. So like, I get what you're saying, that it's emphasizing a truth that we don't have to be having sex to be valid, authentic human beings. Perhaps we can deny certain appetites or aspects of ourselves and still be fully human. And we have to say that in order to legitimate single people. And so the repression, like not having sex can't just be repression. It also has to be an expression of a healthy, fulfilling life in its own right. I get it. But yet those purity culture contexts are not really usually the ones saying that. They're the ones that are overemphasizing the family. James Dobson, focus on the family. It's all about the family. The way of the family, so goes the nation.
Yeah, and let's take let's analyze the context in which that was created in. Yes, it forgot about singleness. We can say that, but that's more of a critique within purity culture. It's not a critique of purity culture. You could say that it needs to be supplemented by a good idea that there needs to be people who are single. What I would say in response to that is that look at who it was talking to. It was talking to a culture that was very quickly seeing family, seeing marriage as a sort of supplement to your life. Get married, get divorced whenever the person, doesn't really suit your lifestyle anymore. If you're unhappy, sleep around, figure out who you're sexually compatible with. Those were the major things that you saw every time you turned on a television. Everything you watched, every movie you saw was just inculcating this. And so the church had to respond in some way. Was it a perfect response? Absolutely not. But the whole point is whether or not it was justified and good for what it did. And I think that you can still make a very good case that yes, as a first step towards giving Christianity some sort of response, I think it was good. Because what's the alternative, right? You say purity culture is bad. So what do? We just go back to sleeping around and telling people they need to have sex to be sexually fulfilled? Look where that's gotten us.
So I think you can have sexual ethics and purity, quote unquote, without overemphasizing it to the extent that purity culture has overemphasized it. Because in most church communities, you can get a job as a minister, even if you have horrible Christology, if you don't really understand the relationship between Trinitarianism or grace and works correctly, as long as you say the right things about X, Y, and Z sexual issues, premarital sex, homosexuality, these types of things. But like, let's look at Jesus. What is Jesus talking about? He's almost always, when he's talking about sexual issues, he's almost always talking about it in the context of forgiveness. What he's talking about in the sense of condemnation, as the things that he's constantly talking about, he's constantly hitting on, are taking care of the poor, about greed of the wealthy, about the hypocrisy of the religious leaders. And yet, those aren't issues that we really talk about much at all in our churches. Why aren't we doing that? Well, perhaps is it because America is the wealthiest country in the history of the earth? Are we picking and choosing and emphasizing sexual purity instead of all of these other things? Like, why is this what we're going for? Why is sex the number one thing we're talking about? Why is it purity culture instead of poverty culture? Why have we just focused on this?
John, because of context. More people die in America from overeating than undereating. Should we still help the poor? Yes. Are churches doing that? Yes. But in the context, poverty was a much bigger issue in first century Jerusalem and Judea than sexuality. Because sexuality, those norms, those practices were being just instilled in people. And I think you're wrong. Jesus did focus on this. He did try to protect marriage. He did say, when he looked at protecting families, which is what purity culture is trying to do, he did say, don't divorce your wife except in the cases of adultery, and don't divorce your husband except in the cases of adultery. We see him pushing to protect marriage as God intended it. So yeah, it's in a different context, but it's meeting the context, trying to get to the same end that purity culture is trying to get at. And yes, should we focus on poverty as well? Yeah. But the reason the church focused so heavily on that is because it very obviously was something that was just in our face going into the 80s and 90s with the rise of basically sleep around hookup culture. That hookup culture didn't exist in first century Judea.
Yeah. It's interesting because I don't think of poverty as somehow lessened because we're in a wealthy culture. The wage wealth gap between the richest in this country and the lowest is massive, especially when we start factoring in minorities and all these other groups. And
but wealth gap, it doesn't measure poverty, John. So for instance, if half the population is millionaires, the other half is billionaires, that's a massive wealth disparity. But should we feel sorry for the millionaires?
And I love
the gap, it doesn't measure poverty.
I love that you brought up more people are dying of overeating than undereating in this country, because why isn't gluttony the topic of choice that we're focusing on? Well, I over and over again, you're going to say, yes, that's a good point, John. Let's also include that. But what I'm saying is, what are we emphasizing? Sex has been the thing that we're emphasizing. Sex and family values almost over anything else, any other issue. But you see this as
competitive,
but here's my point.
Okay.
Here's my point, is that in America, it is conceivable that someone could say gluttony should be the thing that disqualifies you from leadership. Gluttony is the primary issue that disqualifies you from da-da-da-da-da. What's the justification for making sex or homosexuality or premarital sex what disqualifies you from leadership or these other areas? I think most people might say something like the quote from Paul that says sex is the one thing you commit against your own body. But guess what? Gluttony is a sin that you commit against your own body.
No,
gluttony
not in that context.
Yeah,
No.
No, but I'm saying the underlying principle applies today. Gluttony is a sin you commit against your own body. And you can die 20, 30, 40 years earlier in the flesh.
That's not what he's talking about.
I know I'm not saying he's talking about gluttony. I'm saying the underlying principle that he's talking about sinning against your body can be applied to today. So why are we choosing sexual issues over other equally bodily, equally self-harming activities? Is it perhaps because this is a country of fat, gluttonous people, and I am a fat, gluttonous person within it, and it's not convenient to talk about these issues?
The church used to talk about gluttony, and then it capitulated. It didn't do a good enough job resisting that early on. So the church is trying to... It's so good for the church for not trying to repeat that. Should it talk more about that and combat that? Absolutely. But I really want to get to your scriptural interpretation. When Paul says, he who sins sexually sins against his own body, that's not, you're harming your body. Because quite often sex doesn't harm your body. If anything, the the chemicals released are good for your body. He's not saying that. What he's saying is the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. The harm to the body is not physical, but spiritual, in the sense of what union does God have with ungodly things, right? It's this union that happens in sex between the godly and the ungodly. That's the conversation here, which is why it's so important. And that's why he thinks sex is so important. If you are a Christian who is the temple of the Holy Spirit, when you get into union with another person through the sexual act, something very spiritual goes on there. That doesn't happen when you eat a hamburger. There's something very deep and spiritual that needs to be protected, which is why Paul is so concerned about this and why the New Testament generally is so concerned about this.
I understand what you're saying, but I actually think you can only say it once you've disembodied and despiritualized the physical world and the act of eating. I think eating is a deeply spiritual act. As someone who struggled with weight and even throwing up at a younger age when I was in high school, I struggled with bulimia and these other things. I can tell you that those things had deeply spiritual weight.
Let me clarify.
Let me finish. And as someone who has also learned through fasting and other things that these can be very spiritual disciplines, and as the fact that the sacraments are the eating of Jesus's blood and body, and somehow that has spiritual significance. I think as embodied incarnate beings, we don't want to pretend that the physical act of eating can't be weighted with deep eternal sacrificial, like sacred significance. So I understand what you're saying, but I want to push back against it and say I actually think eating has an equal or arguably equal spiritual significance.
Well, you're not pushing back against me. I want to say, yes, a lot of what you said is true, but you're not pushing back against me. You're pushing back against Paul. What does Paul say? All other sins are outside the body. What does he mean by that? He's not saying when you eat, the body isn't involved. Of course, everything is involved, both inside and outside. What he means is when you have sex, what you're doing is you're creating a union of bodies in that sense. And that is unique. The union of bodies there, that is what makes sexual sin so unique. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that somehow eating is completely not spiritual at all. Obviously, I'm saying that. And Paul would say that as well. But the inside the body with the body that he's talking about there is very much in the context of the union of two bodies in the sexual act. That's what I'm saying. And that's obviously very different from eating.
Yeah. Well, and I understand that point, and I think there's a real discussion to be had there, and we could explore further. But I think at times we're ultimately going to have to weigh Paul and Jesus. And my point earlier was that we're going to have to interpret Paul in light of Jesus. And what I was saying earlier was, well, what Jesus really focuses on constantly, like I just read back for the Gospels, all 4 of them in preparation for this chapter I'm writing, and it is insane how much all he is talking about is money, the poor, and hypocrisy. Sure. And I get that you're saying America isn't poor in the sense that some countries are around the world or first century Jerusalem. I get that. But our people at the top are richer than ever before as well. And those are the people Jesus comes down hardest on, is like,
how many of those wealthy are high schoolers, though?
And so, but let me finish.
That's what purity culture is directed at, is high schoolers.
No, but it's not just about who's talking to high schoolers. It's about the thrust of our entire culture. We are the wealthiest nation in the history of the planet. No other nation can really compare to this moment and this place at this time. What should be the primary thing we're talking about? I think it really should, logically, as Christians, be the thing that Jesus seemed to talk about nonstop as well, which is about the systematic hoarding of the wealthy and the first making themselves so dreadfully first above all the people who are last.
There's a weird assumption here that the number one thing we focused on was purity culture in church, which I've never known a church that was their number one focus. Maybe in youth group, which is, a thing, but here's the thing. You don't focus so much on money in youth group because kids don't have money. That's the thing. So your critiques, that's fantastic, but not a single one of your blows strikes against purity culture because they're directed at different objects. You're saying, yes, condemn the rich for their hoarding of cash. Wonderful. Purity culture isn't aimed at the rich. It's aimed at the poorest people in society. Kids who have no cash, right? And are living off their parents and are able to go out and sleep around and do all this stuff because mommy and daddy give them money to do this, right? So I can see this as being in conjunction with purity culture, right?
I would say 2 things in response. First of all, I think the understanding about materialism and wealth, even if you don't technically have wealth, if you're taking it from your daddy's pocket or your mama's pocket, you're already using wealth and getting access to the means of production and the wealth that it spews. And materialism,
take people on dates and sleep with them, right?
Materialism needs to be talked about in high school before you have material yourself. Precisely in preparation for later stuff. So I don't think...
But they do!
I don't think your critique is correct. Furthermore, purity culture isn't just a high school thing. Purity culture is an overarching view that dominates so much of Christendom. It's why our political stuff isn't focusing just on preventing premarital sex among high schoolers. It's focusing on the family, on homosexuality, on abortion, on all of these sexually related family things. It's purity culture is about not just high schoolers, it's about the family and the sexual life that continues on past 20, 30, 40. It's not just a high school thing.
No, but it mostly is, right? We talked about purity rings and these are being marketed to high schoolers, saving yourself to marriage. That's a high school college thing when you have the least
Totally.
amount. But here's the thing. I actually think your critique goes both ways. Look, I think your critique actually can encompass both aspects, right? Because the primary problem isn't so much money itself, it's the hoarding of money. It's the objectification. It's turning everything into a profit for self pleasure and gain. It's the selfishness that motivates it, right? This desire to hoard, to objectify, to use the world for the sake of our own selfish pleasure, that's something both a critique of wealth and a critique of sexual promiscuity both are trying to hit at. It's a common disease that impacts both. So I don't see why you're saying, oh, we need to emphasize this at the expense of the other, when both of them are really coming from the same place.
Which is actually very in line with my point. My point is, why are we overemphasizing sex over all these other issues that are arguably deeply related? Why are we willing to have elders who are greedy, who are overly wealthy and not using that wealth for the sake of others? But we would probably almost never have a elder who was violating certain sexual issues around premarital sex, adultery, homosexuality. Why would we have that be the case? Why are pastors, many of whom are the celebrities of conservative evangelical culture, why are they millionaires? And that's not critiqued or at least evaluated publicly. But if they had some sort of sexual indiscretion, that would be the end of the world.
I think there's two things here. The first off is, at most, you are calling for a more consistent purity culture, which is fine. But then again, you're supposed to be critiquing purity culture writ large. This doesn't feel like a critique of purity culture. It just feels like a critique of how it is being implemented, right? Which is to strike more at the cause, which is this hoarding of objects that I talked about. Fine, fair and dandy. My whole point is that as a first step of addressing these social ills, purity culture got us at least one step further rather than just ignoring the issue like we did with gluttony in the 1950s and 60s when obesity rates started to rise, right? And number two, when it comes to that, I think the reason for this is because there's always been a sort of disagreement on how exactly wealth ought to be used. Because, for instance, actually having wealth is not a bad thing. Otherwise, God is the most evil thing out there because God is the most wealthy. God owns cattle on 1,000 hills. The question is the using of that wealth. But then how much do you need to use it, right? Whereas with sexuality, that's a very public, overt, intentional act that's very easy to diagnose, to see. And whenever you're trying to have people who are beyond reproach, that's a much more clear marker that you have crossed a line in that capacity. So I think it's less about, it's just ease of church. Like, ease of church decision making is really, it's like, yeah, this is a very clear thing. If you're living with a girlfriend, you're not going to be an elder. But, oh, you're giving 5% to the church, whereas, normally we try to say 10%, it becomes very difficult.
For your second point, I can see what you're saying, but I could also see the exact opposite being the case. What you do in your bedroom is private and in your bedroom, whereas the quality of clothes that you're able to buy, the car that you roll up to church in, those types of wealth signals, the job you have, even the language and vocabulary you use, those are all bound up in the economy and lifestyle of wealth in very public ways. So I get what you're saying, but I could see a counter to that. And as for your other point about how this is a critique, it's just a critique of consistency, I guess my point is that, I haven't really argued against purity here. We can have that as a separate discussion about purity as a value. I've been arguing against purity culture, a culture that makes this the or one of the dominant things that it's focusing on, to the exclusion of other issues. So you keep saying it's just a matter of emphasis. Why can't we talk about this and other things? And that would be great, Seth. It would be great if we could talk about this as one among a whole host of other issues, but that's not the case. What are the primary issues that...
It isn't?
I think
I don't think it is. Talk about this. I think they do. Maybe not enough, but they do talk about this. You keep treating these as exclusive.
But I
I
mean,
know I am, because you're wrong on this. Go ahead.
what are the major political issues Christians have cared about in this country over the last few decades? They are almost entirely related to sex, gender, and the family. This interconnected trio. It's abortion, it's homosexuality, it's premarital sex, it's the family, focus on the family, it's gender roles, it's transgenderism. It's these sexual things, the genitalia stuff, the stuff that has us without our clothes on. There's something about this that has just drawn the ire of everyone for the last 40 years or so. And I think that is an overemphasis. I'm not saying that any of those moral issues are even necessarily wrong. I'm simply saying we have emphasized it such that we're not just talking about purity, we're talking about a purity culture, a world where this is all that we're talking about, or at least an overemphasized aspect of what we're talking about, to the exclusion of things that I think Jesus talks about a heck of a lot more than he does about this.
I gotta push back, because you keep saying this is all we're talking about, and that's just patently false. That, of course, this is not all we're talking about. You didn't even grow up in purity culture. I did, and I can say that is patently false. You can say there's an overemphasis on that to the exclusion of other things, and I think that's debatable, because I see these as all wrapped up in one single issue. But I have to just say that is just patently absurd to say all we've ever talked about is sexuality. And more to the point, the question, you haven't actually critiqued why we talk about that. Why do we talk? And let me finish. Like, it's about, because what does family teach us? It teaches us self-sacrifice. Kids are no longer something you need for economic necessity to take care of you in your old age. They're really expensive headaches. And now the church has to fight to even say you ought to have kids as birth rates are dropping. That's very important for the culture. That's extremely important to see that kids are valuable in themselves and not just because of their economic value, right? Protecting the family is also protecting these sorts of things as well. Why do you protect sex? Because marriage is important, because marriage teaches you self-sacrifice, to give to the other person, to sacrifice career so that the other person can flourish. Why is family important for faith? Because faith is most inculcated in a family context. Look at fatherlessness rates and the lack of religious transmission. They go hand in hand. So all of these issues are bound up in the family, and the church has rightly emphasized that. And just to say, oh, if we had just focused on money more, well, first off, I think that would have been completely ineffectual, because honestly, I think most people in our culture would rather just get rid of Christianity than rather get rid of their wealth. And so that's not to say we shouldn't emphasize that, but it's just to say that when it comes to the effectiveness of the strategy of combating a wealth culture, I think focusing on the family might be one of the keys to doing that.
So you basically double down on focusing on the family, you appealing to scriptural principles and these sorts of things. But Paul is the same one who in 1 Corinthians 7 says those who have families should live as though they didn't. Jesus and Paul are both single. Jesus is the same person who says, I did not come to bring peace, but I came to turn a father against their son and a daughter against their mother. When a guy comes to Jesus and says, hey, I want to follow you, but I'm part of a nuclear family. Let me go bury my father. Jesus says, let the dead bury their own dead. Jesus and Paul are not 21st, 20th century American focus on the family, nuclear family descendants. They're not.
Paul tells us to take care of our own family first before going to the church. He very much emphasizes caring for the family. The verses you're talking about actually prove my point. When he says, let me bury my father first, was him wanting to get his inheritance, wanting his father to die so that he could be financially secure before he followed Jesus, right? And so, like, that had nothing to do with familial commitments. Now, the other verse where he says,
stop using exegesis, Seth. I don't care about your carefully reasoned, gotten into the Greek, logical arguments. It's all about who yells the loudest, Seth.
But I take your point about father, I came to turn son against father, that verse, right? But again, that's about commitment to Jesus, right? The nuclear family is powerful and important up until it combats your commitment to God. In the same way that Paul tells us to obey the government, even while he disobeyed the government when it ran up against his commitment to God, right? And that's all that's going on there.
Well, but Jesus also says when his family comes to him, he says, "Who are my mother and brother? Who is my brother and sister?"
Yeah.
It's whoever does the will of God. He almost tosses aside the familial relationship. So I get what you're saying. You can interpret these verses a certain way,
And
you
yet
can
James is a leader of the early church.
Silence, heathen. Let me finish, devil. Get behind me, Satan. You can find verses that support what you're saying, and you can interpret my verses to twist away the meaning. And I get that there's a real debate there. My point is that Christians have made it seem like there is no discussion, there is no tension there with the text. Clearly, the family is all that Christians care about. And I think it's way more nuanced than that. And that if you actually get into Paul and Jesus, you are not going to get this sort of modern Western, the family is all that matters type of thing that you're looking for, unless you do so by excluding a lot of stuff. And perhaps you can still find a defense of the family in the text. I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm just saying it's not as clear and obvious as people think it is. Now, let me pivot here because I think
I'd like to switch roles.
Well, let me say one more.
Then I get one more thing.
Okay, but fine. We've been talking less about whether, this is the right emphasis or not. Why don't we talk about, does it actually work? Is focusing on purity and sexual purity this much actually achieving what we want it to achieve, which is sexual purity and all of these things?
Let me go against that.
Let me say one thing, and then we can switch and you can get into it.
Okay.
I was reading in Kierkegaard, he talks about anxiety, and he says that before the fall, there was the awareness of the choice. God says, do not eat from the fruit. And in that moment, they were aware that they had options. And the anxiety they had over the fact that they could choose between those two options. And that, oh no, we're going to sin, we're going to screw up. And that anxious side of them is actually what preceded the fall itself. And I wonder if this overemphasis on sexuality all the time in our youth groups and subsequent conversations, and every day, check in with your accountability partners, put a porn blocker on your computer, this constant focus and anxiety about sexuality, I wonder if it actually causes us to freak out about it, to constantly be like, oh, I don't want to stumble. Oh, cover your eyes. Don't look at that girl who's passing you every 10 seconds because she's too hot, or that guy because he's too muscular. Like this constant focus on sexuality, does it actually help us stop thinking about sexuality? Or is it kind of like someone yelling, hey, don't look at the elephant in the room every 10 seconds. And what are you going to do? You're going to look at that elephant.
Definitely not. Okay, let me actually add to that, right? Because in Romans, we've talked about Paul, right? In Romans chapter 7, Paul says, until I had a law, until you told me not to do something, I didn't want to do it. But the moment you said that I couldn't do it, all of a sudden I do want to do it, right? And he's wrestling with his own inherent sinful desires in Romans chapter 7. And so again, that's what purity culture does. If you look at purity culture, the people who put on the rings, they have this consistent reminder every day they put on this ring, or every time they look down at their hands, that I can't have sex today. What does that cause you to dwell on? Sex. What does that cause you to idolize? Sex. All of a sudden, the whole point was to combat the idolatry of sex that we hear in pop music and see on TV, where sex is supposed to fulfill you. And now all of a sudden we capitulated and said, no, we said, yes, it really is an idol. It really will fulfill you, but only in the right context. All we've done is taken the sin of the world and given it a brand, making kind of Christian gloss on it. And honestly causes us to obsess about sex all the more and turn it into an idol. So that's what's wrong with purity culture. That's why it's got to be got rid of, John. We're pivoting, and I'm pivoting because we need to pivot.
Wait, you just pivoted? You pivoted midpoint? So you're against purity culture, and I'm purity culture?
That was all against purity culture.
Yeah, I know, but I was just confused the whole time, Steph.
Right. I let you have the last point.
I was conversationally, sexually confused, and I need someone to tell me who I am.
You normally are, John.
Pastor.
You're married to my sister.
Well,
you have two boys.
This is really confusing. All right, so I'm defending purity culture now. Okay, yes. I can do this. Let's. I'm getting ready for it. Okay.
Right now, I'm winning.
Okay. All right. Purity culture. Purity culture just encourages this incredible interiority. I don't know of any other culture where you have guys, high school guys, young adult guys, these types of things coming together to talk about their interior life, their thought life, what they're doing when they're alone at home, and to talk about their sexuality and their thoughts and desires and longings. That doesn't happen in culture writ large. Like, guys aren't having those conversations for the most part, but that happens in Christian Bible colleges and youth groups. They're talking about those things, and sure, some of it might be kind of weird, and it might be like, you might think that it's repressive, but they're having actual conversations about sex in a conservative culture that traditionally hasn't talked about sex at all. And the fact that those conversations are happening at all is positive. Seth?
Yeah, but let's not do evil so that good may result. What are those talks reinforcing? They might make, young students more open. They might bring out some of these latent tendencies and stuff that need to be worked through. Sure, but all under the banner of idolatry, right? Flash that in rainbow colored signs above their head, because that's exactly the thing that we're emphasizing. Yeah, you're having lustful thoughts. Get rid of that so you can have an even better marriage, so that you can have the best sex life ever. And this is just prosperity gospel minus the money and plus the sex, right? God will bless you if you obey him.
There's nothing wrong with saying that sex can be good. It can be incredibly good. It just can't be God. And purity culture can hijack the society's promise that sex will give you everything and say, you know what? It actually will give you quite a bit. We can take what is good because God made the body and called it good and incarnated in it as one of us. So the body isn't yucky. We can say sex is good. It is pleasurable. It brings joy and it can bring satisfaction and fulfillment. But it can't do that in the ultimate sense. We, as purity culture, we have to affirm simultaneously that sex is good, but that it is not God. And that tension is hard to get, and I think we've struggled with it at times, but I think overall, churches are saying God is ultimately what matters. But if you honor God and you are willing to wait and give him some of your best physical years in waiting for him to bring about the right partner, then yes, he will give you this good gift of sexual satisfaction. But that requires you to step out in faith and trust God first and put him first above and beyond your fleshly desires. And in that doing, precisely in the abstaining from sex, you are saying, God, my physical desires are important, but not as important as you. And I'm going to wait until you decide, if you decide at all, to bring the right person into my life. That's an inherently correct hierarchy.
But purity culture says more than this, right? Obviously, sex is a good thing, but idolatry is never a bad thing in the place of God. It's always a good thing taking the place of God. Because we're not tempted to put bad things in the place of God. We're not tempted to put pain and suffering in the place of God. We're tempted to take good things like food, drink, and sex and put it in the place of God. And that's my point, is purity culture does violate that. What you're talking about is just good Christian sexual ethics. But purity culture says, if you have sex before marriage, you are taking that into your relationship with your spouse, right? And so think about Joshua Harris, the video he did for I Kiss Dating Goodbye, where he's standing up on the altar saying, I do, and behind him is all the girls that he had had sex with. And she's like, who are they? And he's like, I'm so sorry, right? Recognizing that his sexual life can never be good again because he brought all this baggage in. And so what is the promise there? The promise is you can only have truly fulfilling sex if you wait until marriage. Now, whether that's true or not, that turns sex into an idol. That turns it into, I am doing this not because it's the right thing to do, but because I get paid at the end. I get something better at the end. I'm getting some good, like, I'm holding off on sex so that my sex in the future will be better, rather than I'm doing this because this is God, this honors God here and now, right? It's always a, deferred payment down the road. And that's what I think is very problematic.
So I think any good thing can become an idol. Yes. Right. But that doesn't mean we should get rid of all good things and never talk about them and never strive to have them. And just because purity culture is trying to seek these things doesn't inherently mean that it's inherently idolatrous, just that some people will overemphasize it and turn it into an idol. And more to the point, I've read Joshua Harris's Not Even a Hint book, and in it he talks about how God can forgive you and cleanse you of your past partners, and how that sexual side of things doesn't have to haunt you for forever, and you can move forward. I think a lot of purity culture has been stereotyped as constantly making your past sexual exploits this stain that can never be washed away. And it has been done at times that way, but most of the books I've read about it recently really do emphasize grace and that God can forgive you. A huge part in the whole purity culture lineup is, hey, you've done sex stuff. Come to Jesus, altar call. He can cleanse you and wash you and help you be as new for your marriage. That's almost always been baked in to at least later, more recent versions of that have sort of helped correct the overemphasis on the staining part.
I don't think it's been stereotyped. I think it just is inherently contradictory. Here's why. Because I was told growing up in purity culture, save yourself for marriage because God will bless your marriage then. God will do great things, blah, 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 blah. But if I end up dating someone and find out that they had previous sexual partners, I was also told, don't hold that against them. You're to forgive them. It should not impact your marriage. It's not a big deal. So it was a big deal until it wasn't a big deal. And so they try to hold both things at once. I don't think it did it consistently. And all to the point that I just think that this was inherently problematic. We spoke out both sides of our mouth there. Is sex a big deal? Well, yes, if you're a virgin, but afterward, no, as long as you've got forgiveness. And all of a sudden, it's just like, is it or isn't it?
So any culture talking about any issue ever is going to have difficulty holding two sides of attention together.
But that's a problem.
Culture sucks at holding nuanced thought together, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't at least strive to do it. And what I would say is, I don't think the culture said, oh, don't have sex, it'll really damage you. And then they also said, oh, but if you did, you can be forgiven. I think rather they said, if you did have sex and do all this other stuff, that is potentially something that can be problematic, but God can work through that with you. And so let's start that active process of unpacking that and praying through it and talking about it and growing through it. I don't think they would ever say that you can just do whatever you want sexually and then as long as your partner says, oh, it's okay, I forgive you, everything will be fine. No, I think they would say you can eventually have a healthy sex life. It doesn't have to scar you and stain you forever, but God's grace needs to shine in there, and that can take a few years to process and work through stuff. Just like with any sin, if you struggle with alcoholism, God can forgive you of that, but you still might have to deal with the ramifications of that for a few years. And so, no, you're not tainted for forever just because you're an alcoholic. That doesn't have to haunt you and ruin your enjoyment of beverages forever. But it does mean you have some stuff to unpack, and it would be better if you hadn't been an alcoholic.
Even the language you're using there is still about enjoyment. Sex is not about enjoyment, and that is the idol. And that is what's wrong. Sex is about the union, the spiritual union, the creation of family, and that sort of things. And the pleasure is a wonderful thing that comes in addition to that.
That's an excellent supplement to the culture. And I would add it as an addendum.
It's a contradiction because the way you're even described the culture is always about, oh, but God can redeem the pleasure. It's all about the pleasure. Hold off for the pleasure. Pleasure, 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 pleasure. Everything about sex treats it as an idol. Everything, even the not having sex, is so that sex can still be better. It's always first and foremost about the pleasure of the sex rather than the spiritual growth and union of that. That always takes second fiddle, whether it's said explicitly or rather sort of under the surface. So I'm sure you could find some teachings that say it differently, but having grown up in it, it really is. It is a prosperity gospel, right? Would you say, well, God will bless you with wealth, but it's really not about the wealth. It's about blessing and then using those wealth to bless others. Prosperity gospel can justify themselves the same way, John, but it's still the prosperity gospel.
I think you're saying a lot of good points, and I understand it, and I can say we need to think about those things more, Seth. We really do. As good Christians, we need to do that. However, I think you're failing to realize what purity culture was in response to, and you touched on it a bit before. which was
You ran out of points, so you
the
stealing mine?
sexual revolution. And not just that, the mass production and access to pornography. We have a society that is steeped constantly in pornography, where you can't get online without ads just popping up. And every 12-year-old, and I think the statistics say that by like 8 or 9, your kid has seen porn. We have an overly saturated pornographic epidemic that is going on. And sure, purity culture has overstepped at times in response to that, but it is rising to fight a battle that had to be fought. I can tell you lots of ways in which World War II, the Allies made mistakes, but I'm sure bloody happy they went out to fight the war anyway, regardless of their mistakes.
Yeah, but here's the thing, right? Is this battle winning or losing? And what I would say is that it has already capitulated to the enemy's objective, which was to turn sex not merely into a means to an end, which is our own spiritual fulfillment in relationship with others, but as an end in itself, which is exactly what pornography is. So I'll go so far as saying purity culture at its worst was the same as pornography. Because, let me quote G.K. Chesterton. Idolatry comes not just from making false gods, but from making false devils.
Yeah, I think there is a sense in which whatever you end up fighting against, you end up becoming. To quote Ultron, from the Age of Ultron, we all become the thing we hate. Well, he was Ultron quoting Nietzsche, the robot quoting...
You really went with Ultron over Nietzsche?
I was contextualizing to the culture, Seth.
Fair.
Who knows Nietzsche quotes these days? I would love it if people knew Nietzsche quotes. That'd be great.
Kanye West does. That which does not kill me can only make me stronger. So Kanye
Doesn't
West.
kill you, makes you stronger.
But that's a different horrible story on its own.
Gosh. So I get what you're saying about the idolatry thing, and I think I've already responded to it, and I get that you're just pushing back to, kind of win, but it's kind of a boring point, Seth. You should move on to something more interesting to just keep the conversation going.
You're just like, well, sex is a good thing, we need to keep the ethic. You can keep the ethic without the idolatry.
Can you just respond to the porn thing a bit more directly as a specific issue? Can we take the idolatry critique as a valid one overall, but can you respond to porn itself?
Here's the thing.
Let's hear a defense of not fighting porn. That's interesting. Give us that, Seth.
Okay, so purity culture, when it comes to pornography, I haven't talked about that, but the idea, it always is wrapped up. You should fight pornography. The question is what's being sold to you, right? Pornography will ruin your sex life. Yeah, there seems to be statistics to prove that. But here's the thing. It still is about the good sex. Everything comes back to the good sex. So I do think my critique wraps up with pornography, because what we're selling to youth, what we're selling to kids is don't look at pornography, otherwise your sex life will suck. Which, even if that's true, which it does seem like statistically that looking at that pornography does have a negative impact on people's sex lives, the goal is spiritual maturity. Whether or not you ever get married or not, you should not look at pornography. Period. Because of your commitment to God, not because of your commitment to your future spouse. That's always secondary.
But that's not a critique of purity or of its wide-scaleness as a purity culture.
I'm critiquing purity culture.
You interrupted me. You interrupted the exact point I was making. That's not a critique of purity, nor the attempt to make it wide-scale through purity culture. It's a critique of perhaps a specific iteration of purity culture as it currently is, but culture is always going to have to grow out of these weeds and work for these things. Your critique is valid, but it doesn't negate purity nor purity culture as a whole. It's perhaps, if anything, just calling for a reformation, not a revolution. And so,
here's the thing. Whatever comes out of this isn't going to resemble what purity culture was. Whatever comes out of this has to be such a complete disavowal of what purity culture stood for that I don't think calling it purity culture will really make sense anymore. In fact, I think there needs to be a complete reevaluation of how we raise kids, how we have the family, these sorts of things. That's more than just telling kids don't have sex, right? That does not work. You want to know why? Because it used to be the average age of marriage was in early 20s, but also purity began around 16 or 17. So when we used to ask kids, essentially, wait a couple years to have sex because you're going to get married and then you'll, have sex. That made sense. Now the average age of purity, depending on if you're a guy or a girl, is between like 9 and 12.
Because
very early on.
Yeah.
Yeah. It starts at that age. And the average age of marriage is like 27 to 29, somewhere within there. So we're asking them to wait a decade and a half to not have sex at their sexual peak and saying no, 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 God's going to bless, as well as the pornography issue, which is becoming ever more prevalent. It used to just be you had to get on the internet. Now it's literally in my pocket on my iPhone. I can access porn. And it's becoming unsustainable. So whatever comes out of this, purity culture of just the consistent no's is not going to work. We need to be completely rethink what we're doing. And having purity culture fools us into thinking we actually have a solution. And the solution is idolatrous to begin with. So it's problematic all the way through.
You know what the answer is, Seth?
What?
More abstinence-only education.
No.
Doubling down, Seth. Abstinence only. You're teaching algebra at school? Abstinence, Seth. Physics, geology, zoology. Animals don't reproduce through sex. Abstinence. They just cellularly double at some point. We just need to absolutize abstinence, Seth. That's the answer. But in actual answer to what you just said, I forgot what I was going to say, and now I'm just confused. But what I would say is, okay, you're saying that the wait from 9-year-olds to 10-year-olds to 20 years later when you actually get to have married in this culture is not plausible. I guess I could just see the purity culture proponent saying, yeah, so the culture's stupid. Get married earlier. So block the internet so your kids aren't seeing it so young and they don't get full access to it till they're 15 or 16. They're precisely trying to shrink those things in purity culture. And even if they weren't able to, sure, a lot of people, perhaps most, might not be able to wait those decades to get married while dealing with their sexual issues. But since when is Christianity about populism, about helping most people to do just all right? The gate is narrow, Jesus says. And so the fact that it doesn't work well for everyone doesn't negate that it is the way to the truth, Seth, because Jesus is calling people to a hard life, and most people, counting the cost, won't be able to do it. Ha! Purity cultured! Purity cultured!
Boo! Those solutions are very short term. Yes, get them married earlier, but our kids are less and less mature as time goes on. They're less and less capable of actually sustaining a marriage. And so what you end up doing is you get kids who just get married to just have sex. And as soon as the thrill wears off and the disappointment of what sex actually is, that it really isn't the idol they were promised, when that begins to set in, that's when real marital problems begin. And this is why so many of these marriages that I've seen where they got married early on are, even if they're still together, which a lot of them aren't, are consistently battling with problems because they were so immature when they made this decision. They did it just to have sex. Again, we're using sex as a bargaining chip,
so I get
which isn't healthy.
I get.
And also,
let me address that before you get on to the next thing. Can I do that?
Well, let me just say this real quick. What if you block the internet as soon as they become an adult and they do have access to it at their sexual peak, in their early 20s? What are they going to do? They have none of the character to stop it. They've never had to learn the character to say no to pornography. They've never had a chance to. So those 2 points.
Yeah. So your first thing about getting married earlier, actually, a lot of people make this assumption that it's just religious prudes wanting to have sex and to release their inhibited, repressed desires that leads to all of these young marriages. Statistically, I'm not actually sure that's the case. Conservative purity culture Christians tend to be in small town areas that are more conservative, even amongst non-religious folks. And conservative small towns, even non-religious ones, tend to get married younger. I have actually seen some studies that suggest there's not a significant difference between marriage age in conservative small town areas between religious people and non-religious people. And so perhaps this critique that bad marriages happen because people get married too young because they want to have sex, is it actually making sense of the data? Because a lot of those marriages would have happened anyway. And I think we both know tons of non-religious 19-year-olds in Joplin, Missouri, who got married not because they wanted to have sex, because they were already having sex, but because they were 19, they'd finished high school, life seemed kind of boring, and they didn't know what was next, and everyone was getting married. So that's kind of small town conservative culture. I don't think you can just blame that on purity culture. Second, what was your second thing? Because I'll get to it, Seth. I'm coming.
blocking pornography
No, there was a thing
doesn't
before
teach
that.
the character.
There was
right?
a thing before that.
I don't know.
But I had such a good response to it, and now I don't remember because you wouldn't let me
That was my
interrupt
main
me.
point, right?
Yeah. So, let me just keep talking till can I just have a second to remember what it is?
I guess.
This is embarrassing. Performance issues.
Yeah, I know. I'm not surprised.
Here it is. I got it. So you're saying that all these couples getting married young and then getting divorced really quick. Well, I got married at 22. I've been married for a decade. That doesn't prove anything, but I know tons of people who have very incredibly satisfying early marriages. Would I get married that young again? I don't know. But what I would say, what I would say is that a lot of people think you need to find yourself first before you get married. But in a weird way, being married this young has allowed us to find ourselves with each other and to go through that journey together. I think it's a very individualistic, Western, atomic, isolated culture that thinks that personhood and individuality is more fundamental than community and intimacy and relationship to identity. I think personal individuality is always worked out dialectically in conversation with the other, with your friends, family, and yes, your lover, your marriage partner. And in contrast, what are we contrasting these young, too early, sexed up marriages to? The culture? Like 50% of marriages end up in divorce.
That's not true.
It's not like society has figured out a better alternative to traditional Christian marriage at a young age. We're not doing it better. Lots of people are getting married in their 30s and 40s, and they're still getting divorced. Like, it's not like society has figured out a better alternative. So why should I negate mine because of your stupid alternative that isn't working either?
So the marriage thing, 50% of marriages, that's kind of unfair because here's another statistic. Over 70% of people are still in their first marriage. It's because, like, if you take me and the guy down the street has had 3 marriages, they've all failed. And my marriage has succeeded, right? You just take us 2, then 75% of marriages fail. Because there's 4 marriages, 3 have failed, right? So it's kind of an unfair statistic, right? And so, no, yeah, the culture, we can make fun of them here in a bit. But my point is you said, okay, let me give you an analogy.
It's like arguing with an encyclopedia. Where are all these statistics coming from?
Right up in here. So let me give you an illustration. Would you marry a 13-year-old to another 13-year-old?
No.
But today, 19-year-olds today are pretty much what like 13-year-olds were back in the day when it comes to maturity. Can 2 13-year-olds who are married grow and learn relationship and learn the struggle? Yes, but we still don't do that for obvious reasons, right? We think they need to grow more before they make those sorts of commitments. And yet, now that our adolescence is continually being prolonged, simply pulling back the marriage age is essentially like asking 13-year-olds to get married. It's not a good solution. And so purity culture's solution is not fixing the problem. And that's my point. Can it have, good benefits? Sure. Absolutely. And you talk about, like 17, 19, 19-year-olds that we know who got married and they weren't religious. Yeah. A lot of them are in terrible relationships as well, right? Just because they do it because they feel justified because the religious people around them are doing it, right?
But my point was that I don't think there's actually significant statistics that suggest that religious people are actually getting married that much earlier, that they are getting married at the same culturally appropriate time as the culture around them. If that's in a big city,
you can't then say that purity culture is pulling it back. You can't.
Okay, fine. I'm contradicting myself, but I believe in contradictions. Seth, read monotheism. No, but my point being that, so I guess this is one of those, if they are pulling it back, I can defend it. And if they're not, I can defend that too. I'm kind of hitting all defenses. But they don't have to all be consistent with each other as long as they account for all of the counterfactual things you might say in the moment. And that's because I'm not really trying to win the argument. I'm just trying to win a rhetorical point.
So. Sure. Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, please consider subscribing and leaving us a 5-star review. We're an up-and-coming podcast, and every little bit helps. Also consider joining our Patreon page. Patreon sponsors have exclusive access to unaired episodes, different kinds of merchandise, the ability to suggest an episode, and even an hour-long interview with Jonathan and I. Check it out at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com and see what you're missing out on. Sound effects from zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.